So, hello everyone. I'm Betty Wong, and this is my co-founder, Emily Kalbick, and we'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the Founders Over 40 Unconference. Today, we're going to learn what it takes to buy a company, and then what it takes to change that company to fit the personality and the needs of the founders. So sometimes this means you buy a franchise. Sometimes this means you find a business that is already existing that you want to buy. But before we start, I just want to make a few announcements and give you a little bit of a recap for those of you who may have missed last week's session. So first, we want to recognize and thank our advisory board for all of their work helping us to put this conference together. Ed Rogoff and Elizabeth Eisel, who were speakers during day 1, and Judy Messina, who is moderating our panel and introducing our keynote today, as well, who moderated one of our panels last week and is introducing our keynote today, and we'll be interviewing her. Also, we want to thank Carlos Vassallo and Stella Lupashore, Raymond Gill, Jeremy Keegan, Jeff Wright, and Ting Zhang. And we want to mention our sponsors, the AARP Foundation, FranNet, the Global Center for Social Entrepreneurship Network Foundation, and the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Initiative. And not the very least, we want to thank the very small team that helped to pull this conference off and continues to work every day. Leslie Cabrera, Charlotte Tomic, Daniela Viola, Peter Kalbig, Leslie Chan, Tony Palladino, and Deborah Albert. And now let me share some of the highlights from last week that ties into the 4 words to describe why I set out to help create this conference: longevity, money, passion, and relevance. So last week, our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Eisel, very kindly shared that the US is behind most of the first world countries in terms of our government helping older entrepreneurs. So President Biden, step up. Longevity was my kickoff word because I share that many of us hopefully will live to our 90s and 100th, and we want to do something interesting with the second half of our lives. Money is another key word because most retirement funds are not set up for people living until their 90s or 100, and therefore we really need to think creatively about how to generate additional income. Elizabeth basically said, hey, if she can start something at 60, well, just 60, why not all of you listening if you haven't started already? So another word of inspiration for the conference is passion. And our speakers from session 1, Deb Bullinger and James Rousseau, really share their passion of how much they want to help people, partly based on the journeys that they both took to get where they are today. Deb at the Great Do-Over and Launch Lab, and James at the Core Link Solution. I think the big takeaway from both of them was to be open and keep learning because you can always do more. And my last inspirational word for this conference is relevance. And our last 2 speakers from week 1 shared a lot about their work that is so relevant to our lives today. So for all of you who have any health costs of any kind, you definitely need to check out Gene Pinder's Clear Health Cost website because you may find out how to save thousands of dollars on your health procedures. And if you have children or grandchildren, you may want to check Tanya Van Court's Goal Setter app, which helps families manage money for their college funds, among other expenses. For those of you who missed the sessions, you can send me an email at betty@stage2startups.org to get the links, or just check your inboxes from earlier this week. Now, Emily's going to share why we think this unconference is really important and intro Judy Messina and Kat Rowlands, who both coincidentally are graduates of Columbia Journalism School. Emily?
Wow, thanks, Betty. So first, welcome to day 2 of the Founders Over 40 Unconference. As Betty noted, we have another great day of speakers all teed up to inspire you. Now more than ever, we think it's a good time to explore new opportunities to become a founder after a career working for others. The pandemic has upended all our lives and caused many of us to reevaluate our priorities. Many older workers have either lost their jobs or resigned since the pandemic started 18 months ago. But long before COVID, baby boomers and Generation X have been redefining retirement. As we live longer, baby boomer and Gen X workers will need to prepare for their future, which is probably why over half of baby boomer and Gen X workers expect to work after the age of 65, either because they want to or because they have to. Elizabeth Eisel pointed out last week that millions of older workers are starting their own businesses, and that these businesses tend to be the most successful. So it's not surprising that the highest rate of entrepreneurship worldwide is among those aged 55 to 64. More and more people are looking to become their own boss after a career working for someone else. Last week, we heard from founders who had a great idea and turned that idea into a successful company. But many entrepreneurs have also found success by buying a franchise or business. Today, you can learn what it takes to succeed from entrepreneurs who have bought and grown a business started by others. So let's get started. First up is a fireside chat with Katherine Rowlands, owner of Bay City News. She'll be talking with Judy Messina, visiting fellow at the Center for an Urban Future. Judy is an award-winning journalist with extensive experience covering business, technology, healthcare, and higher education. Prior to joining CUF, Judy was a senior reporter and contributing editor at Crain's New York Business. As a freelance journalist, her work has appeared online at outlets such as NBC.com and CNBC.com, and in numerous publications, including Modern Healthcare, Investment News, and Advertising Age. With that, let me turn it over to Judy.
Thank you, Emily, and I'm delighted to be here today for the second round of Stage 2 Startups Founders Over 40. Today, we're going to talk to an over 40 entrepreneur who, as Betty and Emily have told you, who rather than start a business, bought a business. She's Katherine Rowlands, president of Bay City News. Katherine has worked as a journalist for 35 years, covering news in the Bay Area, Central California, and overseas, and as a 2017 JSK Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. She focused her research on how to overcome gender disparities in newsrooms, especially in leadership positions, and how to bolster local news coverage in the Bay Area. In 2018, she bought Bay City News, which is a local wire service covering the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area, where she worked as a college intern 3 decades ago. As you may know, a wire service reports and gathers news and sells stories to newspapers, broadcasters, other news outlets, both print and online. And Bay City News covers 12 counties and sends stories 24 hours a day, both radio, print, and digital, out to other news outlets. In conjunction with that, Kat also founded the nonprofit Bay City News Foundation to support public service journalism in the region. The work of the foundation is published at localnewsmatters.org, where the stories are free to readers. The foundation raises money from individuals, grants, partners with universities and other nonprofits. It also runs stories from other journalism outlets that have the same standards and values. And we're going to talk a little bit more as we get into it with Kat about the combination of a for-profit and nonprofit enterprise. So let's start, Kat. Welcome. Let me start out by asking you, what was happening in your life at the time that you bought Bay City News that made it possible for you to take the risk of buying and managing a business?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. Great question. I often talk about my journey as an entrepreneur and a business owner in terms of the stage of life that I was at and how risk factored into the timing of that. So I was in my early 50s. Both of my parents had passed away after a number of years of caregiving, and both of my adult children had already graduated from college. Plus, I had a long career working in different newsrooms and actually around the world in different freelance opportunities. And all of that led me to a desire to step back, get off of the treadmill for a little while, and think about what do I want to do next? And how can I put all of my experiences together into something new? And is this the right time? So for me, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship at the Stanford John S. Knight Journalism Fellowship Program, which gives journalists an entire year to take advantage of all the resources on a university campus and think about some of the biggest issues, the biggest challenges facing journalism. And it was in that moment that I learned there was an opportunity to buy the company where I'd actually started my career. So there were a lot of factors that just serendipitously came together at that moment. And I wouldn't necessarily have thought that this was an opportunity coming my way. So we'll, I'm sure, talk a little bit more about how you capture a moment like that. But certainly the time was right for me with all of those factors, and just having the ability to say, now is the time when I'm willing to take on a big risk.
Thank you. As a lifelong journalist, buying a news service was a natural in the sense that you knew the business, if not actually managing or running a news business. Certainly you came armed with knowledge and experience about writing and news gathering and what makes news and what's not news. Still, Kat, what's different? What was different about buying a news service versus, say, a tech company or a hardware store? What was going on, you know, the challenges of the industry certainly are one thing, but it's a different kind of business, let us say, than you know, selling milk or you know, or you know, developing tech chips, computer chips. Anyway, if you please.
Yeah, I mean, I do have friends who have decided after 10, 20, 30 years in this business, which can be grueling, lots of stress, lots of late nights, lots of giving up holidays and weekends and time with family and friends. And there are many who say, enough, I want to do something completely different that has a really different feel to it and maybe more control over your life and how you spend your time. But for me, I just couldn't imagine doing anything else. And believe me, I've thought about it from time to time, wondering, is there a different way to use my skill set and my experience? And there are lots of different things that you can do. But for me personally, it's all about doing a very mission-driven endeavor that is my life's work. So when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and that never changed. I was editing my high school paper and my college paper. I went to graduate school in journalism right after college. I did freelancing during the summer. All of those stepping stones on the path toward establishing a career. So although there are ways to certainly pivot to doing different things in life, for me, I really wanted to expand on what I had already done and build that mission-driven work.
A news service, again, is, you know, different from other businesses, and news is under pressure. I don't have to tell you, as an industry, and there's enormous competition. Did you have people who tried to discourage you, or did you have second thoughts about going into this particular business because of the pressure it's under and the competition? And how did you come out of that with the positive view of that you could make it work?
Yeah, there's a lot of due diligence involved in taking on a company or something that is as risky as local journalism, because you can look around you and see how challenging it is. Yeah, lots of places have gone out of business. Lots of places have really struggled. Even the new entrepreneurial startups have had a hard time getting sustainable funding over the long haul. So given all that, there were certainly a lot of well-meaning naysayers, but a couple of things were important to hear. One was, I had someone who I had worked with years ago who had tried to do his own thing, and he said, just be sure that you have a number in mind about how much you're willing to lose, and don't go past it. So this comes back to the idea of how much risk are you willing to take? Are you willing to lose your house? Are you willing to start over from scratch? Are you willing to only get financing that you know for sure that you can meet? All of those kinds of things you have to sort of pencil out and look at deeply to see what you're willing to lose. And that was a really good piece of advice, because if you go past that, you have to know that you're putting other things that you weren't willing to lose at risk. So that was one thing. The other thing was that a lot of the business types that I asked who were not in journalism said, don't do it. And the reason is that they had a very different motivation for their life's work. So they were into businesses that would have more of the hockey stick growth curve, where there would be an investment up front, there would be a period of testing and iteration and growth, and then there would be huge growth, so that there would be a massive return on your investments. And so their motivation was really to see the kind of technology or Silicon Valley type entrepreneurial growth for a startup. And that is one motivation that some people have, and it wasn't mine. And so I was very discouraged for a long time with so many people saying, no, don't do it, it's too risky, until I had this epiphany that, well, my motivation is completely different. I'm in journalism because I feel it's important to society. It's a public service. It's something that I know how to do. It's something that would be horrible if we as a community lost all of that local news. And I felt like I could do something about it. And my motivation was not to make a lot of money. It was to be sustainable and to be able to support a staff and an organization over the long term, but it wasn't to become rich. And so once I realized that the motivations can be very different in terms of what your endeavor is, then it sort of fell into place and made me feel confident about why I was doing this. So if you think about sort of the mission and the motivation and the meaning of what you're doing, those three things can really be the guiding principles for decision making.
That's very inspiring. Thank you, especially from another journalist. So you knew the news business, certainly as a reporter and an editor, and having participated in it, if I can put it that way, throughout the world. What did you have to learn though, Kat? The learning curve you had to climb in order to manage and run a news business, very different from reporting and writing the news.
So much learning and so many mistakes. And I feel like I'm a lot wiser 3 years into this than I was when I started. And it has made me think about how we teach our younger journalists who are just starting out about the importance of how the business actually works, because it's a really different thing to make payroll than it is to pull off a great story. So both things have in common that you need curiosity, you need to be open-minded, you need to be a good reporter and ask lots of questions, not be afraid to ask quote unquote dumb questions to be sure that you understand how things work. But there are many things that you have to learn as an owner and as a manager that are just not part of doing the journalism work. So for example, having to come in and literally input the hours of staff into payroll service and push send and be sure there's money in the bank to cover it. Learning about what kind of insurance is required to cover your operation, whether it's business insurance or libel insurance or directors and officers insurance if you have a nonprofit. How to be sure that you have all of the things lined up in terms of taxes and in terms of all the regulatory requirements that you might have to meet. How to be a renter if you're leasing space in an office building. how to make sure that your staff is not only motivated and feeling good about the work they're doing, but also safe. And certainly that has come into play for everyone with COVID this last 2 years, where we have to figure out a whole new way of operating and working so that you can not only make your business continue to run, but keep your employees safe as well. So those things really were not part of my education up until the point that I bought the business, and I had to learn. Because I did this on my own and I did not have a partner when I bought the business, it's been critical to build a wide circle of advisors and allies who do know how to do all those things I mentioned and can really help guide along the way and be open as a sounding board to ask questions and discover things. I once upon a time flirted with the idea of going back to school and getting an MBA. That is one route to go, where you can actually sit in a class and learn the skills that you need. But I really did it on the job, and that's another way. And so probably there's maybe a few more mistakes, but because every situation is so different, I think you oftentimes do just have to learn along the way.
Building on that, Kat, you said a building and having to build a network of advisors and people with expertise. You talked before about when you were thinking of buying the company that you had, you had plenty of naysayers and your own doubts, self-doubts about buying it until you had your epiphany about doing a mission-driven business. Did you also, in that process, have people you trusted, advisors, mentors, who helped you not only get up the learning curve in managing a business, but said, go ahead, do it, Kat. This you can do this. People who were supportive and felt that this was something that could be done, even though it was going to be tough.
For sure. And really, that's what is part of my satisfaction, is to have relied on people in my network and then be able to share our successes together as well. So I think that that's probably one element of starting or buying a business later in life that really is helpful, is that you have a lifetime of connections and friendships and colleagues and allies. And because you have history with all of these people, they're oftentimes really wanting to see you succeed. And so going back to when I was at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, that is a network that I still maintain, and I love to see my former classmates from that time back in 1989, and they are thrilled to see somebody tackling the local journalism challenge. And so they have been helpful to me with friendship and ideas and donations. The same thing is true when you think about people who were part of Bay City News. The company itself was started in 1979. So more than 4 decades ago. And we've counted up that there's probably 500 people who have been through the company during that time. They were oftentimes young reporters just getting their start in life. They wanted to get practice in reporting and editing and writing, learning how to cover local government, how to go to a court hearing, how to report on a fire, like all the sort of bread and butter basics that you need to learn as a starting reporter. Some of them stayed for many, many years. We had one woman who just recently retired about a year ago after starting with the company back in 1979. But we have many others who have gone on to have fantastic careers working at other newspapers, TV networks, doing freelance work, magazine work, going all over the world. And all of those people felt like they had something to be proud of, and they refer back to their time as this kind of boot camp journalism, by working at the local wire service, and they feel thrilled that Bay City News is continuing on and following in the way we always have, where we provide opportunities for younger people to get a break, to get a foot in the door, to get some experience. And those people have come back in droves to say, way to go, we're so excited to see you continue the company. Can I volunteer as a mentor? Can I donate to the nonprofit? Can I provide connections for sources or story ideas? That is extremely gratifying to have those people who have come back and say they want to help. So yes, there's many examples of these kinds of networks where you can tap into them when you know that people have skills or advice that you might need, but also you can be pleasantly surprised where someone comes out of the woodwork and says, I've been watching from a distance, how can I help?
That's remarkable to get that kind of encouragement, that kind of buy-in, that kind of support. I don't know whether you had any resistance, but it sounds like that the employees you who were at the company already really welcomed you, as opposed to resisting you because perhaps they were so used to the old management. So you didn't run, yeah.
One thing I'll say about that is that I had actually, because I started out there as an intern myself,
right,
while I was in college and came back several times to the company in various roles. I had done every job, every shift, every role up to the point of being managing editor of the newsroom, but never having been involved in the business side. And so at least on the journalism front, they knew that I could empathize with what it's like to do the overnight graveyard shift, that I had experienced, trying to rush on deadline to get that city council vote in before anybody else, that I was understanding of how difficult it was to schedule 24-hour-a-day staffing. So because I had actually worked in the newsroom, that gave me more credibility to come in and say, let's keep doing what we're doing, but let's try some new things as well.
Other surprises, any other surprises, Kat? You talked about a surprise about employees, current employees, offering to help. Any other surprises, either in running the business, perhaps in your among clients of the business that you encountered as you took it over and began to run it?
One thing that was a not so great surprise, it wasn't completely out of the blue, but the technology debt was significant when I came in. So there was a need to reevaluate what systems we were using and how we could adapt to the very fast-moving world in terms of what our clients needed, the ways that readers get information, the most efficient ways for us to work as journalists. And so that's actually what scared me the most, more than the finances, the staffing, the money, anything. It was the technology. And so, finding in 2018 that there were, dusty pagers around and dot matrix printers being used for sending out invoices, and a super heavy, difficult manual phone system, and lots of other things on the back end, including satellite dishes and lots of ways that had worked for many years and frankly was ahead of its time back in the day. Really, technology moves so fast that there was a need to start assessing how to modernize everything. So we were fortunate to have a partnership with Microsoft, and they provided some equipment and some software and some training to really modernize the entire operation. So I was grateful to have a knowledgeable partner who was willing to invest in a local news operation and be able to show how legacy operations can be transformed into ways that meet modern demands. So just a couple of examples. We got laptops, and fortunately they arrived just before COVID shut down all our offices. And so instead of having desktop computers in places that we could not occupy anymore, which are generally like city halls or county administration buildings where old-fashioned press rooms are shared by multiple organizations, everyone was working at home, so they needed laptops. So that was a way for us to make everybody more mobile, which is the direction we wanted to go anyway. And then being able to work on some software that allows us to distribute more efficiently to our clients was really important. And getting it all into the cloud was key, because otherwise everything was in my living room behind me here. And so it meant I couldn't go for a walk for more than an hour for fear that the system would go down. Like there could be a power outage, the internet could drop, something in the server could go wrong. So I would have to scurry back and reboot everything and start everything up. By moving things into the cloud, I can actually go on a vacation. I can go out to dinner. I can go for a hike more than an hour away. So things like that were really key to assess and start to move forward. And now I feel way more confident that we are sustainable and able to respond. The last example I'll give is that we have always been a text-based service. So we write stories and we send those text reports out, but everyone needs photos, images, videos, audio, data, graphics, all of those kinds of multimedia components of a modern story have to be something that we work toward providing to our clients just to keep up and to be responsive to their needs. So having that technology in place to do all those things was really critical.
It sounds like if you hadn't had Microsoft as a partner and a contributor, you would have had to have made a big investment in technology to modernize and actually to do what you do best. How did you strike that partnership? How did that come about?
An old connection. Again, it goes back to a former colleague who is involved in helping local newsrooms all around the country to modernize and put in place technology that helps them do all the things that I just described. And also, one of the networks that I have cultivated is through an organization called Journalism and Women's Symposium, JAWS for short. And they happen to be having a conference coming up this weekend. And for more than 35 years, these are women who have been frustrated in their own newsrooms and hit a glass ceiling, were denied proper pay, were turned down for promotions, or who were told that they could not do certain assignments. And there was a desire to come together and share stories and try to figure out solutions about how to overcome all of those things. And so this has been a group that I have really loved and been part of for many years. I've served as the president for a couple of years, and it's a network that I rely on as a safe place to say, I'm feeling vulnerable or frustrated or angry or lost. And somebody in this network has been there before. And so it's extremely helpful to go back to that group. And the person at Microsoft not only was a former colleague, but also part of my JAWS group and a longtime friend. And so that was just one of those serendipitous, lucky, important connections that came from earlier in life that came back around and really helped us advance.
The talking about philanthropy of a sort, you have a hybrid organization. You also run a foundation. Tell me how that works, what the foundation does versus what Bay City News does, and how do they work together?
So Bay City News, as I mentioned, began in 1979, and it's a C Corp. So I own all the shares for the company. And it has operated sustainably, but with relatively low profit margins for all that time, because it's a difficult industry, but also because, as I mentioned before, it's really around a public service mission. And we feel that it's critical to be able to provide important information to people in a timely, accurate way. And so it's not really meant to be a big moneymaker, but it does have to be sustainable. The growth, in my mind, has to come from either offering new products and services or by building in other ways to bring in revenue. And so when I acquired the company in 2018, the first thing I did was to establish a 501c3 nonprofit to live alongside the company. So the two are different legal structures. They have different parameters in terms of taxation and a little bit in terms of operation, but they are both essentially mission driven. And having a nonprofit makes a lot of sense for many communities that are struggling with ways to get local news coverage of their town or city or region, because it's tough. I mean, the advertising model, which sustained most news organizations for many, many years, has essentially collapsed. It's very difficult to maintain subscriptions that make up for that lost revenue. And so there's lots of work being done around how to make news organizations sustainable again for the long term. And in some ways, a lot of people are coming around to the same answer, which is that philanthropy has to be part of the picture. So if you care about knowing whether your public officials are doing their jobs well, if you care about being alerted when there's a wildfire sweeping through your area, if you care about what volunteers are doing in their communities to bring good works and services to people in need, all of those things used to be covered by traditional media, and they have fallen by the wayside because we're under such tremendous pressure financially. So many times it's the nonprofit, purely public service driven work that picks up the slack and does those kinds of stories. And so whereas the Newswire produces a product with lots of breaking news, lots of civic coverage, we have a date book calendar, which is all verified, so people who buy that can see exactly what's happening around the region every day. And that is all sustainable for the company. But for covering the local arts festival and for doing that kind of investigative public accountability watchdog journalism, and for doing the trend stories where you pull the pieces together into explanatory journalism, that is actually driven by the contributions from donors who understand the importance of having that in the language of our community, like to be able to have some shared understanding of what's happening, whether it be good or bad within their community. And so we have been able to raise $450,000 last year from grants and donations, both large and small, to support that kind of public service work. And then we in turn make that available for free on a site called localnewsmatters.org. And so the public is able to tap into that resource and not be bombarded by paywalls or advertising or any kind of barriers to access. And then because I own both sides of the enterprise, I can cross-publish. So if we do a public service piece on the Local News Matter site, we can also put it onto the Newswire. And when it gets blasted out to all of our media clients, it has the potential of reaching 8 million people, because we have as clients on the newswire TV, radio, print, and digital. And so it's almost like a bonus story for them because we're not charging it. Remember, it came because somebody donated money for a public service story, but they're happy to get it. They're strapped like everybody else in terms of having resources to cover everything they would like to cover. And they can use that story, send it out to their audiences, and then we have tremendous impact. So if it costs like $100 or $1,000 to create a really substantive public service story, then we can have that investment, if you will, that donation stretch hugely across the region. So it's not just on one website or one newsletter or one social media post, but it can be redistributed through all of those other media outlets. So I think this is a very interesting and sustainable hybrid business model for local journalism that could be tried elsewhere. And the other thing I'll say about this experiment is that if you can imagine that in some years, any business might have a downturn, but if you have philanthropic resources to do the public service work, then you can put more emphasis on that side of the enterprise. The next year, maybe everyone is struggling to collect donations and that revenue goes down, but the business is sustainable. And so overall, the two sides can kind of even each other out because both are aiming toward the same goal of informing our communities in an intelligent and expansive way. So I think that this has the potential to really work in any kind of metropolitan area. I'm pretty focused on doing the work right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but we talk a lot in our industry groups about sharing ways to try things so that other people can benefit from my experience as well.
Sounds like a very promising model. Is it fair to think that as your impact has grown, local news matters, as its impact has grown and more people have seen it, is it fair to think that it is getting easier, difficult years aside, sort of during COVID and other kind of economic downturns, but is it fair to think that as the impact becomes known, it gets easier to raise the money?
Yes, I mean, visibility is important. And
right.
So the Local News Matters website originally began 3 years ago as kind of a display platform to show our donors what their money was paying for. And it has almost accidentally become more of a destination site as people learn about it. And so we're having to pivot now to think a little differently about that platform. So we have more emphasis on social media now. We have created a couple of weekly newsletters. We have partnerships with other local media, and all of those things are helpful to drive traffic to the Local News Matters site. And that's all for the good, because it just means that we're developing a loyal, sustainable readership. And it allows us to continue experimenting there. So once we have audience at a critical mass, we can test things, we can survey our readers, we can try different data visualizations or information hubs or different types of storytelling with video, for example. And all of those things give us feedback to iterate on our journalism and do more of it. And so it's been interesting, the conversations we've had on our team the last year about ways that we can continue building on this audience. And it may be that we get to the point where we can start looking for other ways to monetize it. So if we find that readers really want a daily newsletter with breaking news in their inbox every morning, that's something that we could try. If a local bank or a local community center wanted visibility for their events or their brand, we could try a sponsorship and see if that's a way to bring in additional revenue. But I'm always mindful of not ruining the experience of the reader to be able to have this wonderful opportunity not to be bombarded with things that they are normally turned off by, whether it's paywalls or pop-up ads or whatever else. So it's a balancing act, but we have the flexibility to try different things.
Again, a very promising model. Last question, Kat, because I think we're going to take real questions from the audience in a couple minutes. Lessons learned, advice that you might give someone who is considering buying a business, what to do and what not to do. What would you not do, or what mistakes did you make and would advise somebody not to do? So lessons learned, both sides of that coin, please.
I think probably being a little bit more realistic about the investment upfront. There's always hidden costs, like I mentioned, the technology debt that I encountered, which without having a partnership would have been very difficult to overcome. And so actually working out with a financial advisor or somebody who had been through this before to know exactly what that cost could be would have been smart to do ahead of time. I suppose, you know, by the same token, you could be discouraged from going ahead if you really knew what exactly all the costs and the risks were. But on the other hand, it's better to be prepared. So that's one thing. Also, I think being mindful of how much personal investment it takes in terms of time is an important thing to think about and to give yourself extra leeway for. I mean, if it weren't for the pandemic, I probably would have been out and about a lot more in my life, as everybody else would too. But I didn't have anything else to do, so I basically sat here in my office and tried to save local news. And and so I've spent 2 years basically just working, but it does take a toll. And I think it is important for anyone who's launching into an entrepreneurial adventure, shall we say, that they carve out a few boundaries just to have some self-care in the equation, whether it's not missing your weekend hikes, or it's not working after 8 o'clock, or whatever those things are that bring health and joy and a little relaxation. I think it's important to remember to do that for yourself.
Thank you. Well, it looks like you've accomplished your mission of saving local news in a very good and big way. Emily, I'll turn it over to you now. Are there questions from the audience?
Yes, first, thank you, Kat, for those wonderful insights. There was one question that came in earlier, and that is, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with the previous owner? Did you have difficulties with that owner stepping back? How did he or she react as you began to change what the business that was built under the previous ownership was like, et cetera?
Yeah, so in this case, the company was started by a couple, Dick and Marcia Fogel, and Dick Fogel had been an executive editor of the Oakland Tribune. And he had a dream to launch an entrepreneurial endeavor. And I think that they, in the early days, mortgaged their house in order to start it. And so he built the business, and he and his wife sort of compartmentalized different parts of the management, and they brought on a third partner who worked with them from almost the very beginning to build all the business side of it. And the original couple, they passed away some years ago. And so the third owner was at a point where he wanted to retire. So he was actually looking for an opportunity to pass the business over to somebody else. And he has been a fantastic, supportive person in helping to answer questions, but also understand that I might want to do things differently than the way they had been done before. And so I think that those succession planning and transition conversations can be tough. And one of the things that I want to do, even though I'm nowhere near leaving my career or retiring or anything, but I'm already starting to think about what would I do in the next 5, 10, 20 years to make for a smooth transition when I decide to retire. I'm already thinking that way, and it has to do with putting systems in place, documenting things, creating learnings around things that have gone well or things that have been difficult, and then really building in time to have at least a full calendar year to transition with a new person so that you can be there through all of the cycles, because every quarter is different in terms of the financial prospects for a company, for a nonprofit. For our baycitynews.org endeavor, the fourth quarter is when we do lots of our fundraising. That means that the fourth quarter and the first quarter have revenue coming in. The other 2 quarters are often barren. And so how do you plan for those ups and downs of the revenue cycles? And that's something that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you'd had a full year of transition to see how those cycles play out. So that's something that I would really encourage everyone to think about, even if you're nowhere near exiting an entrepreneur endeavor.
Thank you. One just last question. I don't know if you want to expand on, how did you handle that initial money raise to buy the paper?
I had a very old-fashioned bootstrapping mindset where I had some savings, I had some gifts and loans from family and friends. I had really good credit. And we structured the sale in a way that made it possible for me to move forward. So I did not bring on excessive debt, but I did have to gather resources to do some investment. So I think every situation is very different, but there are, as I mentioned earlier, probably some lessons to be learned about trying not to underestimate how much investment capital you need to transform something, because there could be surprises that you encounter, or let's say a big client drops out unexpectedly, or that your growth projections don't play out, or that there's something catastrophic that happens with either your technology or a key person on your team. All of those things can throw you for a loop, and just having a cushion to be able to handle that would be smart.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have now. Again, thank you, Judy and Kat. Great conversation, a lot of good learnings. We so appreciate the time. Before we move to our next panel, again, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for helping us make this all happen. And that's the AARP Foundation, FranNet, Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses, and the Global Center for Social Entrepreneurship Network Foundation. Now we will transition to our first panel, where Leslie Cuban, Market President and Franchise Owner of FranNet, will discuss franchise ownership with Mary Ann Cordiano, owner of CMIT Solutions, and Jose Jimenez, owner of Alpha Graphics. You just need to click on the link for panel 1, which you received in your email, as well as it is here in your chat box if you don't want to quickly find your email. That panel will start at 1 o'clock. So you all have a few minutes to relax, get a cup of coffee before that starts. Again, thank you, Judy and Kat. With that,
Thank
I will
you.
sign off from our fireside chat.